All right, so in this episode of In the East Wing, I am talking to Riley Livermore, a U.S. military veteran who spent approximately 16 years in the Air Force. He recently decided to resign as a result of his opposition to the Biden administration's policy regarding Gaza. In this conversation, we delve into a few things pertaining to his personal life, the decision that he made, and his post-military life. So, without further ado, let's get down to it. All right, I believe we have just started recording. Riley, welcome to In the East Wing.
I appreciate it. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. So, I would love to, obviously you one thing you are known for nowadays is the resignation from the Air Force. I think a career that spanned for 16 years, if I'm not mistaken. And that's something, I think that's the primary topic that we will be discussing together, this decision you made and what ensued afterward, and perhaps a little bit about the process that you had to go through to make that decision. And this is, I think, what the bulk of our conversation will consist of. But at the same time, I do want to say I'm interested in learning more about the person that made that decision, right? I'm interested in learning more about a little bit about your background, and I guess what I would be interested in maybe tackling with you first is the early days of your career with the Air Force, as in you joining the Air Force and your experience in the first couple of years. So maybe you can take us back a little bit to the I guess the motivation that drove you to join the Air Force and how those first couple of years looked like.
Sure. Yeah. So I grew up in Phoenix, Arizona, not too far away from Luke Air Force Base. Both my grandfathers served in the military, and my mom's dad, so my grandmother on my mom's side, he was a fighter pilot in Vietnam, and so grew up next to a fighter Air Force base. Just thought like jets flying over was super cool. And I liked engineering and I liked airplanes. Like I want to be a fighter pilot in the Air Force, to be like my grandfather. And so I was in seventh grade when 9/11 happened.
Mm.
And so I think I kind of got swept up. I was like the prime age of, I was old enough to get caught like the global war on terror. I grew up in a kind of a Christian conservative family, right? So just George W. Bush was doing the Lord's work, and some of this stuff kind of fostered this sense of like service. And so in seventh grade, I was like, I really want to go to the Air Force Academy, get my college paid for by the military, and hopefully fly. Um, and so that's kind of what kickstarted my desire, starting in seventh grade, to be in the military, like in a really meaningful way.
Mm.
And so I 2008 is when I got accepted to the Air Force Academy. I went there. So for those of you listeners to understand, it's a four-year university that is it's completely paid for by the government. So you get a free education. And when you graduate, you owe time in service. So a minimum, so depending on your job, once you get out of Air Force, it can be anywhere from 5 to 10 years. So from 2008 to 2012, I was a college student at a military university, the Air Force Academy, studied aeronautical engineering. So my first 4 years of service were as a student. It's kind of like similar to ROTC, if you're familiar with the
That's
ROTC
right.
program.
Yeah.
And then I decided actually that I loved flying, but I loved like the engineering, the science of flying more, and some like the new technology of flying. So I decided to be an engineer in the Air Force as opposed to a pilot. So my first couple of jobs were kind of engineering, and that's when I started working on a lot of like unmanned or uncrewed aircraft. So drones, doing autonomy research, like kind of the next generation of what that looks like to test. So the first 3 to 4 years when I was out, I was in Ohio. I got a master's degree paid for by the Air Force as well. And then I did some autonomy research.
Mm.
I guess if you want me to, I can kind of walk through my whole career or do you have more questions from the early days?
No, we can explore both if the time if the time permits.
Totally.
But I think one thing I'd love to maybe tackle here is two things you mentioned that kind of stood out to me was that you said you grew up in a conservative family, and at the same time you do remember those days when 9/11 happened, and there was, I guess, a sort of heightened patriotism in a way, right? I'm sure at that time a lot of Americans truly wanted to defend their countries and serve their country and want to fight bad guys and combat terrorism, and I think that's quite valid. Um, what I'm trying to get at here is, do you think that that level of patriotism that you've had when you were in the seventh grade remained consistent throughout your years of college and afterward, or do you think it kind of dissipated in a way? Like, were you hearing maybe stories that kind of contradicted with the narrative, or were you still sort of hell bent on really wanting to make a change and serve your country and create maybe a ripple effect where others would also join, right? So how would you describe those years in terms of your patriotic spirit?
Yeah, it definitely dissipated. I think throughout the Air Force Academy is generally, it's kind of like this interesting place where you're in the Air Force, but you're kind of like separated from all the hard things.
Mm,
Or it's there's definitely rose-colored glasses for sure. And I think being out, being active duty, seeing different aspects of the military, you definitely see that you kind of lose. I guess I had this kind of continuing dwindling of like my understanding of the goodness of America, right? I think before I joined the military, just the concept like we are the city on a hill, right? A lot of the George W. Bush type rhetoric of
mm,
America's goodness, like we are, championing democracy across the globe, fighting, you know, extremism, and then as I kind of throughout my career, it became more of a uh, transactional type thing of I'm doing this because it's the Air Force has helped me do what I want, and I'm just, it's not, it wasn't like a out of a, it became less and less of like, oh, this is something that's really, really meaningful.
yeah,
Does that make sense?
yeah, yeah. You felt like it was more like the narrative maybe did not hold water for a long
Well,
time.
it's more I guess it's just way more complicated than I think it's presented to be. So I
Mm,
think that's it. It goes from like just a simple like those brown Muslim dudes over there are all terrorists and are bad and we're all good to like, oh, wait a minute, we're killing people who they're just like you and me. Like there's just like
yeah.
this is like, oh, wait a minute, there's a lot of like money and the military industrial complex is a thing,
Mm,
and we're paying taxpayer dollars for stuff that maybe isn't the best use of it. Like there's just this element of like, oh, there's a lot of like kind of crony capitalism coming on behind here. Like I was very much in the acquisition side of the military, so
yeah.
how the Air Force buys new aircraft, I was responsible for testing a lot of new things. So you see kind of behind the curtain of buying things from these big military contractors and like what the glossy brochure says they do versus what they actually can do, and how much money. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah.
Like some of the stuff that like it's much more simple kind of on the external the facade, but then there's a lot when you kind of peek behind the curtain, you're like, oh, this is a little bit more messy than
Mm,
and less maybe justified than I was led to believe.
interesting. There's when you say when you sense that maybe this is bigger than how it is presented, or maybe it's much more complex. Was it easy to talk about these things with people who are like you, engaged in a similar path of, who are in the Air Force, or maybe were more on the development side, or maybe on the, I guess, in the backstage, right? I mean, was that those sentiments or those ideas that you had, and how they shifted, I guess, over the years? Was it easy to have a conversation about these things, or to talk about these matters in the context in which you were in?
Totally. Yeah. I
Mm,
mean, we're speaking somewhat in generalities here, but I
mm,
think there's a lot of disillusionment within the military.
mm,
It's fairly, I can speak primarily for like as an officer and but across the board, I think there's the advertisement what I'm supposed to do and there's what I'm actually doing, right? And there's a pretty big disconnect in a lot of respects.
yeah.
Um, even deployments, right? I have a lot of friends, different deployments doing what they thought they'd be doing and what they ended up doing is different. So I think there's a lot of frustration how bureaucracy and politics get in the way of what we say we're supposed to be doing.
Right.
And again, I'm painting with broad brushstrokes, but this is something that's not like there's a lot of people who are pretty salty about it.
Mm. So you mentioned that I guess your primary involvement was in research and development, right? How how would you say that was over the years? Did you ever feel like, oh, I want more exposure to, say, the world out there, or were you primarily content with that sort of work in the maybe in the backstage, not in the front lines, right? I mean, what was going on in your head during those years? And and then you obviously you add to that your ideas about how complex our or U.S. military engagement abroad is, right? So when you're engaged in research and development, um, were you ever in a position where you were like, I feel like I might be, I really want to experience firsthand what it's like to be deployed and see things with my own eyes and truly make an accurate assessment? Or were you primarily, say, concerned with, I just want to keep on doing what I want to do, which is development, using technology, working with these, unmanned aerial, these planes or things like that? Is that sort of, I guess maybe it's more
I
somewhat
didn't have that.
complex.
Well, so a couple things like about I got married in 2014, so 2 years after I graduated, I got married, and
Mm.
then a couple years later had a kid, first kid. So having a family, I was not necessarily itching to be go to get deployed. So I was more than content to be. Um, I think my skill set too is such that testing new technology, kind of more the R&D, the science and technology field. So I was very content where I was,
Yeah.
and I thought that's kind of where I could make the most difference for the Air Force.
Right, right. And then you have I read you had some training in Israel, I think for 2 years, right?
Yeah. So
Yeah.
after my first 3 years, I got my master's. I did some research for the Air Force Research Labs, and I applied for an exchange program.
Mm.
And I got picked up to go to Israel for 2 years. Essentially, like I call it. It was a postdoc. It wasn't. I didn't have a PhD, but it was kind of that thing where I was a guest researcher
Yeah.
at an Israeli university. It's called Technion. It's in Haifa.
Mm.
So I didn't. It was on the list. There's a number of countries, and Israel was towards the top because they do some cool stuff in autonomy. It was. I wanted to go to Spain first though, and somehow got Israel, and I was like, oh, this is kind of cool. And so
Yeah.
my wife and I uh, got 6 months of language training where we learned to speak Hebrew, at least enough to survive. And then we lived in northern Israel for 2 years, from 2016 to 2018.
Mm. 2016 to 2018. That's wow.
So
You
I
know,
was there during the presidential election, which was very interesting to watch. The Trump Clinton, the whole campaign, election. Um, so that was really fascinating. Like, there's just so much stuff we could probably talk for hours about. How Israel changed me, just the experiences, and a bunch of different dimensions. But
yeah.
it's a fascinating place to be um, geopolitically. I mean, we're seeing that now, just how much influence Israel has over American domestic politics, right? And
Right.
that's kind of got experienced that firsthand. Um, 2016 election, Trump moved the embassy to Jerusalem when I was there. The Iran nuclear deal was killed when I was there as well. So there's some pretty significant international political events that like centered around Israel while I was like right there, which was pretty interesting to observe firsthand.
Oh gosh, I bet. I mean, one of the things that one of the things that I cannot do at this stage of my life is actually go there because my passport, it literally says it in my passport that this document, i.e., the passport, will not allow you to go there, but it can allow you to go to any other country. And so I've always wanted to go there and engage with both Israelis and Palestinians and just talk to people and hear stories, and have that level
Mm.
of engagement. So when you were there for, 2 years, how would you characterize your level of exposure to both Israelis and Palestinians? Was it enough? Did you feel like you may have had maybe looking back, you would say maybe I should have had more engagements, or your work did not maybe allow that an extreme level of exposure to both Palestinians and Israelis.
Well, it's asymmetric for sure, right? Like,
Mm.
so by definition, just being in Israel, being part of the State Department, I kind of fell into the State Department when I was there. There's pretty strict guidelines of going into the West Bank. You're
Mm.
not allowed to get anywhere close to Gaza. Uh, when I was there, you had to be even like a couple miles away from the border. But to get the West Bank, it was very tightly controlled. I think a lot of the kind of Israeli propaganda, the America kind of perpetuate or I don't say perpetuated, but enforced, right? So like Ramallah is dangerous, or not, like all these places you're not supposed to go.
Mm.
So I never went into like the West Bank proper, which I'm very disappointed I wasn't able to experience. We have some close friends who are Palestinian American with family,
Mm.
and I would have loved to like visit. But I did, unfortunately didn't have a chance. Now we had a number of, so the interesting thing, the kind of semantic or linguistic move that Israelis do, that Palestinians that have Israeli passports are not called Palestinians, they're called Arab. So we
Oh.
knew a lot of, and yeah, they don't call them Palestinians if they are Israeli. They call them Israeli Arabs, right? Christian or Muslim, which is another way of kind of like driving a wedge between the 20% or so of Palestinians who live and have Israeli passports and the rest that don't. So we knew a lot of people, and Haifa specifically is a very diverse, it's probably one of the more diverse cities in Israel. So it has a pretty significant Arab Israeli population. Um, so we knew a number of people who were, their families are indigenous to Palestine, that during 67, you know, I guess 48 and then 67, they just found themselves on the Israeli side of the border. And so they were grandfathered in.
Mm.
And so we got to experience the culture kind of through that way, but it was somewhat, uh, it's just a tricky situation, right? Just because of how dehumanized Palestinians are, the stigma, et cetera. So there's not necessarily maybe the embrace that even those families would probably want to do for fear of their own kind of security and status in society.
Yeah. You said, and that's something I don't know how deep we can get into this change you mentioned that you experienced, but you did say that that experience changed you, right? I think on so many levels, being there for 2 years. So I'm sure you've learned a lot. You've maybe um, seen a different reality than what you were essentially bombarded with before going, right? Maybe seen things that did not live up to expectations. So, maybe, is there a particular example or story that you can share that that falls under the category of the things that changed you in a way when you were there?
Yeah, and I think I'll start with one and maybe we can branch into some more. But
Yeah.
I grew up and was a pretty devout evangelical Christian before going to Israel. And so one of the things that was really interesting moving to Israel is there's like churches, right? But they're generally speaking kind of like your more mainline traditional, like very old school, like not like so like the Catholic Church has things there, but it's kind of like these segmented pieces. But there are a lot of Jews, Israeli Jews, that believe in Jesus as like the Messiah. So, but they don't call themselves Christians because they are still Jewish,
Mm.
if that makes sense. So they're
Messianic
Messianic
Jews,
Jews.
maybe.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's exactly right. So we were part of a Messianic Jewish congregation while we were there. Uh, and it was cool on a number of different levels. Like on a positive side, like I learned way more about Judaism, right? So the roots of kind of the Christian faith. Reading, I became fluent in Hebrew, learned how to read the Tanakh, right? The Torah,
Hmm.
the Old Testament, right? Um and like the actual language it was written in, which is really cool, just to understand like a deeper level of understanding Jewish rabbinical traditions, uh, like just the way the Jews interact with the Holy Scriptures is actually very different from like how I was taught as an evangelical. And so that was like super powerful, but it was also powerful and interesting the dynamics that they cut some of the evangelical kind of like political kind of tendencies got ported over to a lot of the Messianic Jewish congregations as well. So that was like they were very Zionist in nature, which kind of mirrored a lot of like Christian nationalism type stuff. And so I was able to see. I think it's always easier to like critique a culture from like being an outsider, right? Because you can kind of see the stuff that doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
And it just so happened it coincided with Trump's kind of rise in the Republican Party, and I saw similar tendencies, like from my own faith tradition as well, as like people kind of disregarding some of their moral, like the teachings, right, of Jesus in favor of political power, right? And so
Mm.
that was kind of an eye-opening thing for me, and kind of my start to like unwind and like rethink some of my own beliefs and how it interacted on like a political or social scale of just the hypocrisy I saw within these Zionist Christian circles, right? These Jews who were very like, you know, anti-Palestinian, even Palestinian Christians, right? Supposed brothers and sisters in the faith. And then I was able to kind of see much clearer. And so there's a lot of like unraveling of some of my own beliefs and re-examining kind of what I thought, uh, if that makes sense.
Yeah. When you experience this newfound reality, or the reality that already existed before you showed up, I would imagine that it would have been difficult to maybe share some of that, maybe share your testimony with people of a similar background, uh, as with people that have who share a similar background as yours, right? Who grew up in maybe an
Totally.
evangelical. Yeah, I mean that because I'm sure even here, I mean I have conversations with a lot of people who would characterize themselves as evangelicals, and I tell them that even Palestinian Christians, they're not doing so well, and it's hard to imagine how you wouldn't feel some sort of sympathy to your brothers and sisters in the faith, the way you put it. And I think and it's surprising that even a lot of the evangelicals here don't even know that there are Palestinian Christians, which is another shocker to
Yeah.
me. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it was very tough. I mean, relationships in my family. Fortunately, my wife and I kind of went through a similar process together, which has been really good. And we found new community, and we've kind of grown from that. But there's a lot of close friend relationships and family members that the relationship's very different. Or in the case of some friends, like we're not friends anymore, right? And
Oh,
that was hard. There was a grieving period for sure. Uh,
yeah.
but I also think that was a catalyst for kind of wider, right? Like if I had these assumptions and these thought processes about uh, my faith that were incorrect, I started re-examining other structures, right? And so, like the military, American military's involvement and our supposed goodness in the world.
Mm.
I think that was kind of that kind of cracked open the door for like thinking more about American imperialism, uh, how the American military interacts with the rest of the world, like some of the stories we tell ourselves, right, within the military, and like what the perspective is from people who are maybe we have less power.
Mm. Gosh, there's there's something you mentioned earlier about how I think how Jews view their own scripture, how they view the Tanakh or the Old Testament. And one thing I'd love to point out here is that I'm so interested in learning or reading the Old Testament in Hebrew. I just
Yeah,
even the New Testament, ancient Greek. I mean, I'd love to just get. I read about the New Testament scholars and obviously the years that they have to spend to learning a language and understanding a language to read scripture in its original form, or in the original language in which it was written. But I think it's interesting, this thing you mentioned about how you found that their approach is sort of different. Do you think maybe that's something we can just for a little bit briefly explore?
oh sure. So I think you and I'm a little rusty on some of my references, but the we we evangelicals, right? I'll just kind of use the we pronoun there, but like evangelicals, the way I was taught is you go to the scriptures to find out what the answers are to a question.
Okay.
And I think broadly the Jewish approach is you go to the scriptures to find out what questions you need to ask yourself, right? So you don't like a scripture doesn't necessarily close an issue. It tells you what issue you need to focus more on. And I think it's the Talmud, or maybe the Mishnah, one of the two. There's a Jewish rabbinical text, right, where they had a bunch of rabbis. We're talking about again all the kosher laws. Like, what does it mean to observe the Sabbath? What does it mean to do these things? Is this kosher? Is this not? Uh, and what they did is they had a bunch of rabbis who disagreed, and they basically published it all as like, here's a text. These all rabbis disagree, right? They have different interpretations, but the whole point is like the the search for knowledge is really what we're all about, right?
Mm.
Where I grew up is like, Matthew something, 24:17 says this, and therefore that's the answer, right? Like, abortion is illegal because I found some weird proof text, or gays are bad because this, like, I grew up very much like the Bible said it, this line proves it, boom, move on, next question, we'll
Oh.
answer it.
Mm.
And so that was really, really helpful for me. And like, I think that's the whole point, is like, the whole point is the scripture is supposed to draw you deeper, right? Like, that you can't know God, like, just limitations of the human. And so like, this is a way to kind of help you, like, it's part of like the process of learning and knowing, is very like, has a very like Jewish reference, where I think there's a lot more fear in the evangelical tradition I grew up in, of you got to have all the right answers. You got to be able to, like, if someone asks you a question, you got to know like you know, the Bible, where to point to it so you can prove them wrong, and doubt is bad and all these things. And like, there's a lot of fear around that when I kind of realized the Jewish tradition, I started asking more questions. And then that's kind of where I was like, okay, the things I thought were like the simple answers actually don't work at all.
Mm. Now you're gonna have to excuse me if I were to decide to focus on that just a little bit more.
Oh wait, no, I like to this stuff's super fascinating.
Yeah, because I never had, so personally, I've never had a lot of engagements with Jewish believers that hold scripture at a very, very high standard, right? I mean, I've had engagements with maybe people that would consider themselves secular Jews, but I did have a lot of engagements with people who considered themselves devout Christians, who always quote scripture, who would who have very, very I guess strong beliefs, and they do scripture is considered just, yeah, they hold scripture at a very, very high standard. And so whenever I have conversations with a devout Christian, there's always a sense that I feel where their position or their stance or their brand of Christianity is the right brand, and those others, I don't know what they believe in, right? But with your engagements with Jewish believers, devout Jews, how would you say they view these different disagreements? Do they have this sort of crack where they're like, oh, this is our brand, no, the other brand, I don't know if it's actually Jewish, or how would you characterize that idea in the Jewish community over there?
Yeah, and I want to be just my caveat, right? Is I kind of some firsthand experience, but I don't necessarily speak too authoritatively, right? Just this is kind of that, with that disclaimer. I mean, there's the three different streams, right, of Judaism. You have your Orthodox, you have your conservative, and you have your Reformed,
Mm.
right? So the Orthodox are generally speaking the people who like wear the kippah, so they observe Shabbat, right, the Sabbath. They eat kosher, and they generally wear like a the kippah or yarmulke or
Yeah.
something. And then the ultra Orthodox are more like the black and white. Um, so that is a little bit more rigid, right? Like, as far as men and women worship separately, the prayers, they tend to be a little bit more like, quote unquote, by the book.
Mm.
I think there's still a little more openness to engaging and arguing about stuff within certain kind of realms. And then the conservative and reformed kind of get more progressively um, progressive or liberal or whatever flavor of word you want, where like, I think reformed versions of Judaism, you can have women rabbis, etc. And so these tend to be speaking a little bit more open to. They're less dogmatic per se about, it says this here, and so there's a little bit of this. I think there's probably some parallels in, if you look at the spectrum of Christianity as well.
Yeah.
And I think what helped me is, even like in a messianic kind of like a Christian Jewish context, there was still some of those elements, the Jewish elements of like questioning things, working with my friends who were not Messianic, right? They were Jewish, a couple Orthodox friends, talking with them. There's just more of a curiosity, I think. I think there's less fear about what if I'm wrong, right? Like I think there's just more, like they'll argue and have strong opinions, but I think there's less of a, I gotta have everything figured out, otherwise like my eternal salvation is at stake, right? Like
Mm.
there's less of this like existential angst. Again, I'm kind of painting with a broad brushstroke, but that's kind of, in a lot of evangelical circles, it's like you got to have all the right things, figure out all the right beliefs, or like doubt is a kill.
Yeah.
If you doubt, then maybe you don't really believe in Jesus, and then that's how you go to hell, right? There's kind of that there's like that heaviness, I think, in a lot of evangelical circles. That's not necessarily I didn't observe that same tendency with my Jewish friends or even my Jewish Messianic friends as much.
Wow. That's ooh, that's interesting. So you stayed in, there for 2 years, 2016 to 2018. When you
Yep.
finished your trip, where did life take you afterward?
I went back, so I went to a test job in the military. So I moved back to California. Actually, I was doing some work testing. I got a job, a really cool job, actually testing autonomy in California.
Wait, autonomy, you said?
Yeah, so like it's really my first foray into like how do we the whole plan of the group I was part of is it was kind of this emerging, it was called the Emerging Technologies Combined Task Force.
Mm,
But the thought process was, if vendors or people are going to develop autonomous systems, like we, the Air Force, need a way to like how do we test this and how do we kind of wrap our arms around
yeah.
knowing that it's going to be safe to deploy and use.
Mm.
And so my job was like coming up with kind of the framework and understanding, and we did a lot of testing in small drones to kind of create systems and software to enable this to happen.
And as you were pursuing this line of work during that year, or maybe during those years, how how would you look back at those days during that time that you spent in Israel? And
It was,
yeah.
honestly, up until October 6th, 2023, like I had very, very fond memories of my time in Israel.
Mm,
I think I was able to like ignore or minimize the suffering of Palestinians. I still have a few dear friends who are uh, Israeli. I um, I thought I saw the benefits of it in a sense that it helped me kind of in my own spiritual personal journey. Like there's a lot of benefits getting that foreign perspective. I love different cultures, and Israel's kind of unique in the sense that there's people kind of coming from all over the world, right? A lot of the Jewish diasporas come back.
yeah.
So you get to interact with people from all over the globe, both who are Israeli citizens, and I was at university, so I had friends. Like the coolest thing, I mean, I kind of nerd out about some of the State Department kind of wonky diplomatic stuff. So like Israel's just a really interesting place to kind of peek behind the curtain and see kind of mechanics of how this all worked.
Yeah.
But so my lab, right? So half of them is Israeli, the other half were kind of foreign nationals like myself. But I remember one day we were sitting out talking about politics, and I was talking with a Russian Jew who's Israeli, Argentinian Jew who is Israeli as well,
Wow.
someone from Singapore, someone from Germany, myself, and someone from India, and we were chatting about international politics, and it was like the coolest conversation I've ever had because it's like, you know, Singapore, he was a Mandarin speaker, so got some of the Chinese perspective, the Russia perspective, India. Like we're it was just like it was amazing, right? A German. We were talking about World War II. We were talking about like it just that
Wow.
types of experiences. Like you just didn't get as much. I grew up in Phoenix, so there's a lot of like Mexican Spanish culture, but it's pretty bipolar in that sense, right? You kind of have, but just having a diversity of languages, of food, of experiences, it was amazing. Like it was really, really powerful. And I guess I feel a deep sense of shame now that I really like how rotten or just how evil kind of Zionism's turned out to be, like, or how it's perpetuated such an evil in Gaza specifically, but also what's happening in the West Bank.
Mm.
It's kind of that was kind of something that's I'm still kind of dealing with.
Yeah, and where would you say, um, when did you experience that, the straw that broke the camel's back, or however the expression goes?
Oh, sure. I mean, so like obviously October 7th, I think that day's gonna stick with me for 2023 for a while, but I remember hearing the news, checking, shooting a bunch of WhatsApp messages to my friends who are still there.
Mm.
Um, And I knew like the problem, right, is I knew enough. It just is, I don't know, the cognitive dissonance when I was there is like I knew Gaza was bad, and I would talk to my Israeli friends like, hey, this is like messed up, especially Gaza. Like this is an open air prison. But I kind of like succumbed a little bit to some of the talking points is like, oh, but Hamas, right? Like, what are we supposed to do? Like, we can't, we got to protect ourselves too. And so I kind of both sides it. But I knew too, like, there's a saying the Israelis call it mowing the grass. I don't know if you've heard this kind of
Yeah.
colloquialism
Uh,
as far as every couple of years you got to go in there and, you know, mow the grass, right? Kill a bunch of Palestinians to put them in, level set, and then they'll come back. They'll keep coming back. And I also knew too that just in the calculus of retaliation, killing one Israeli equaled, orders of magnitude more of Palestinian lives, whether it's, injured or dead. And so after October 7th, I knew the response was going to be extreme and disproportionate. And even some of the stuff that my Israeli friends were saying back to me really scared me, just the level of dehumanization. And I knew there'd be the Israeli populace would be full-throated in support of what Israel would do. And so it was really, that's kind of when I knew it was bad. I just didn't, I don't know if anyone thought, I couldn't imagine it we'd be almost 11 months later and it'd still be going on. I think that's the thing that surprised me the most.
yeah. Gosh, I mean, when you reach that decision of saying, I want to resign, how did your maybe immediate family or loved ones react to that? How did you voice it? How did you express it? Like, can you maybe walk us through a little bit through that process?
Sure. So the challenge in the military, right, the way it works is you can't just like show up one day and be like, I'm leaving, or give your 2 weeks notice or whatever. There's a whole process of getting out.
Mm.
Um, and uh, on the best, if you were really on top of it and everything lines up, it's like a 3-month process, right? Because there's congressionally mandated training, there's stuff with the Veterans Affairs, um, there's just out processing and working through all the different checklists to get out. So it's by no means a fast process. Um, and so what happened, kind of my story is, I was already pretty disenfranchised with the military. Just as far as I still felt, I think on balance, I felt like the military was doing more good than harm, but it was pretty darn close to like a coin flip. And
Mm.
I think after I saw President Biden's kind of the administration's response to Israel and just like the huggy BB, like give them whatever they want, unconditional support, and realizing that like systems that I was testing potentially could be going over in the future to perpetuate this. It's like I can't. This is it. I can't do this anymore. So that happened in of October was when I hit the button to say like I want to quit, but I didn't tell people. We felt maybe cowardice. I didn't tell people right away that like I was resigning because of Israel. And I think partly was like I knew I still had months to go. I was in a leadership position. I was like trying to find the right balance of like, you know, I don't know. I didn't want to like make a big stink and then have to like sit there for 6 months like waiting for my coworkers. Um,
Mm.
does that make sense? Like I
Yeah.
wanted like it was a kind of internal calculus of like this is really messed up. I was talking to people I was working with, and I was like, yeah, this is messed up. And so it's like, okay, well, I guess um, yeah,
Mm.
it was that. And also I think there's also element too of like I just kept thinking like at every turn like this is gonna not be a thing anymore, right? Like I was still gonna resign, um, but I was hoping it was not become as big of a thing as it kept getting. And that's so really the thing where like I want to go public is after Major Harrison Mann published his letter. I was like, okay, cool, because I thought I was like the only person who really cared about, not really cared, but like was willing to resign because of it.
Mm.
Um, and I didn't really know I had an avenue to like go public, right, beyond like my immediate circle.
Right.
And so that's kind of Harrison kind of let me know like, oh, this is something, because I talked to my leadership and kind of told them what I thought, and uh, but no, I didn't think about like whatever the social media phase or whatever. It wasn't kind of in my uh, conceptual framework until Harrison did it, and I was like, oh, I think I want to say something too,
Right.
and to a broader audience.
Yeah, and there was obviously, I mean, there was a wave, right? I mean, many other individuals decided to come,
Totally.
yeah,
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 starting with Josh Paul, and then a number of really brave people in the State Department, and then other like uh, there's I think 12 or 13 of us, and there's a couple other Air Force. There was a couple of Air Force people, to include a couple of people who are trying to do uh, conscientious objectors. So
mm,
yeah, I mean relative, and this is I can't remember the exact, but I think there was 5 or 6 administration officials who resigned because of Vietnam during the Nixon years,
yeah.
and there's been 13 or 14. So we're having like 2 or 3 times what was happening in Vietnam
Oof.
over Gaza. So there's definitely something, I think it's not necessarily being covered. There's a very noticeable bias towards favoring the Israeli perspective. But yeah, there's a lot of discontent, I think, within the federal government over the Biden administration's enabling of genocide of Palestinians in Gaza.
Mm. And there was something I read in uh, an article that was, I think, written about your resignation, and I think one of the things you mentioned was the use of, what was it, lavender or like
Yeah,
AI
yeah. So I think
systems.
that's right. So the two things. So again, I was just going to kind of, I told some people around me like, "Hey, I don't like what's going on. I'm
Mm,
getting out." Back in October, and I
mm,
realized I had some time to work through the process, uh, and I was just going to keep it at that, hoping that I didn't think it'd go this long. And when Harrison's letter came out, and that coincided pretty closely to 972 and local calls, pretty incredible journalism into these AI targeting systems
mm,
that Israel's been using, uh, and understanding. I think that's when I think it was pretty easy before that to be like, okay, listen, this is a like State Department thing primarily, right? We're selling, or military contractors are selling weapons. Like, I'm not in any such circumstance where I'm like directly involved in this. So I was able to kind of like, I was able to distance myself a little bit more emotionally. And then when I saw that there's similar technologies that Israel's actually fielding in Palestine and like in Gaza in very like kind of dystopian Black Mirror ways, and that were like kind of analogous to stuff that we're working on or trying to test in a much more like uh, I'll call that responsible way.
mm.
That's kind of when I was like, oh wow, some of the stuff I'm testing could potentially be used to, slaughter innocent people, and that was a definite like that. That's when it really shook me, and I was like, okay, that gave me the resolve to like be a lot more public.
Yeah. You know what's interesting? I was talking to a friend of mine, I think 2 days ago. He was in Jordan for the summer. He was going over there to learn Arabic, for an exchange program. Um, and he told me that he had a lot of conversations with Jordanians of Palestinian descent. And he said that all they wanted, well, at least all through based off of these conversations, he said that all they wanted was to have equal rights. They just didn't care who was living next door. They didn't care if it was a Jew, if it was a Christian, or Messianic Jew or whatnot. They just wanted, I guess, the right to return. They wanted to have equal rights, and they just wanted, essentially, just wanted peace, peaceful relations. As long as they have those equal rights with their, I guess, Israeli/Jewish counterparts, they were okay. But rarely would you like that conversation. I mean, people usually don't have that conversation, right? But it's essential. It's essential to talk about how there should at least be equal rights. Like, oh, what we want. That's the foundation, just to have equality. Um, Perhaps we can work on the rest, but let's start with that. right? And I don't know if that's something that popped up when pre October 7th during your time in those 2 years in Israel, or something that maybe popped up afterward. Um, yeah, I don't know if you've engaged in these conversations before.
Well, yeah, it's hard to like go back and I mean, because I've learned so much even now, right?
Mm.
I think I kind of I feel like apocalypse, right? If we use that like very like, kind of generally speaking, it's like this like end times, but I think the Greek word is basically an unveiling or revealing.
That's right.
So like being in Israel in 2016, the Donald Trump election, the kind of the evangelical turn towards kind of more authoritarian um, fascist Christian nationalism. It was like very apocalyptic for me, very revealing to me. Like it kind of opened my eyes in a way that hasn't happened. And I think likewise, October 7th has been very apocalyptic in a sense,
Mm.
both in like the kind of like Hollywood, like just absolute destruction of Gaza and just the sheer horror of the calamity of it all, but also from a what's always been going on is kind of being brought to the light. Uh, and I also think we see there's a lot of like fascistic authoritarian like Netanyahu and the right wing government is there's very similar kind of dynamics that we're seeing in a lot of European countries as well as America. And really at the core of it's fear of the other, right? I think when I was there, you would have these conversations and try to rationally say like, oh yes, but like every time we give the Palestinians some freedom, they turn around and like kill us, right? So there's a lot always fear is the undercurrent that kind of prevented any kind of like autonomy or for like any real attempt to give people power
Mm.
in kind of more representative way.
When you
So that was the thing is it was hard to get. That's like such a powerful motivator, right? And I think the Jewish trauma of the Holocaust it cannot be understated how weaponized that has become by right wing Israelis and
Mm.
Zionist entities. Like that's kind of like constantly held up of like what about the Holocaust, right? Like never again. And instead of like a never again kind of collaborate like corporately like no people group should ever be genocided, we're just viewing exclusively Jews in this in like a lot of times the right wing context.
Mm. And you mentioned the Holocaust, and I want to say also that, well, first off, I mean, horrible piece of history that again should not be, never again, right? But there's also, I guess, in here, I want to really understand what goes on in an Israeli Jew, or maybe a Jewish mind in general. I really think that there's generational trauma as well that has been, I guess, is firmly planted in the minds of I guess Jewish people in general. And so I think maybe, and that's one way of me maybe doing a not much of a good job in trying to understand the Jewish mentality, but maybe there's this idea that anybody who is um, anybody that's trying anybody that's considered a threat is maybe trying to inflict upon us another Holocaust or another genocide. And with you have the generational trauma and you have the memory of the Holocaust, you feel so riled up and you're like, no, this is not going to happen. And so you maybe would decide to want to quash that threat by any means necessary. And so when you mentioned earlier when you tried to two-side it in a way, was that something that maybe you touched on, how, or maybe something you thought about, the generational trauma and how that plays a role in how you deal with people, or maybe the Holocaust and how that plays a role in how you engage with people, right? You have this built-in, maybe this frustration with humanity because they have, for the longest time, were not good to you, right? I don't know. I don't know if I'm actually doing a good job in portraying that image, but I don't know if that's something you may have given some thought. Or...
Well, yeah, I think I bought the premise a little too much of like the only way for Jews to truly be safe is that there's a ethno-nationalist Jewish state,
Mm.
right? I think that's kind of the core premise of Zionism, right? Is for this to never happen again, we need a land that we own and control, that we can ensure that we're always in power, and so that no government can ever come in and start doing, the Holocaust or pogroms or any of these types of things that kind of preceded, uh, right? And so that's kind of the core argument of Zionism, right?
Yeah.
Is we'll find a land for this people, and then they use the kind of the religious and historical Jewish roots to kind of further justify that. And
Mm.
so I think I probably gave more credence to the argument than it deserves. I think absolutely we can keep people. The Jewish existence is not predicated on the state of Israel,
Mm.
right? I think there's thriving Jewish communities. We've shown that there's a lot of anti-Zionist Jews, right? That are, um, and so
Yeah.
if you kind of buy that premise though, like, and that's kind of like the core, and it's sold and packaged very convincingly, at least it was. That's like, then it's um, hard to argue some of these kind of more Israeli or Zionist talking points
Mm.
of, sure, it sucks the Palestinians don't have the same rights, but if we gave them all voting rights, then they would have they would be disproportionately larger, and they could potentially like swing things in such a way that like we wouldn't be able to, our existence as Jews would cease. We'd be back in, Germany 1930 status.
Mm. Yeah.
And so I think because of that fear, um, and I think that the fact of the matter is true, like Israel's current state would not exist if Palestinians had equal rights. But I think that there's something more mutually beneficial could come out of that. But if you the lack of creativity and the fear kind of makes people automatically transport back to, 1930s 1940s Germany, right? There's people who are still alive from the Holocaust. There's, a lot of descendants. uh, there's stories passed down, so there's this very visceral remembrance of the Shoah, of the Holocaust in Israel,
Yeah.
that is very, it's very powerful, right? And I think it's been manipulated and weaponized in ways that have made it such that the Palestinians become the scapegoats, and they essentially are using the same tactics that were used on them towards the Palestinians.
Mm. Gosh. Well, Riley, now that you're out, looking back, I guess, was there, do you think maybe you could have, in any way, shape, or form, made a change when you were in the inside? Or do you think it would have been futile? Like there wouldn't have been something you
Like
could
if I
do?
would have if I was staged, you mean?
Yeah. Yeah.
It was honestly becoming untenable for me. I think the
Mm.
dissonance, because I was in a leadership position. I was basically, I mean, without kind of diving into like the military leadership structure, I supervised 15 people, military, civilian, and contractors. Like I was responsible for multi-million-dollar budgets. Like I was getting a place of responsibility where I was like becoming middle management. I was kind of ownership of Air Force things, and I think staying, like, you can't really, the way the system's set up is like you would just it wasn't it would have been beneficial. Like I would have been sucked back into uh, just kind of following. I would have been forced to a situation where I was going to make a decision, and staying in there any longer would have been me kind of not listening to my own values.
Yeah. And how would what would you say to someone that might have harsh disagreements right now with the Biden administration, and they're still there? They're still on the inside, and they might have these disagreements, but they don't know what to do, how to voice them, or how to maybe express that disagreement. Like now that you're in the outside, how would you what would you say to those people? Maybe they also have grown frustrated with how the situation over there is being handled. Like, what would you say to those people?
Yeah, totally. I think the first thing is like, a lot of people I know are disappointed, and either from commitments they have with the military or financial. I was fortunate, I'm privileged enough that I was able to get out and find a job, that's more aligned with my values.
Mm.
Get medical, like, I mean, a lot of people, between school loans and medical insurance, right? The military provides pretty decent medical insurance. There's a lot of things that kind of keep you in where you don't have the financial means, or you'd be put in a bad spot. And so I don't think I think it's I think the more people that disagree, I think that your voices are heard. I think finding ways and channels of communicating that is super important, even if it's within people around you. I think just thinking more broadly of Harrison Mann probably having the courage to say, um, write his letter and basically do it in a way that's like, I really struggle with this, and I was hoping I didn't have to do this, but I have to do it. Gave me the courage to speak out. I'm hoping that me doing things like this gives people the courage to speak out, even if they don't come to the point of resigning.
Yeah. Well, Riley, I really appreciate your time and doing this and having this conversation with me. I really think it's insightful, and I think next time we're going to get into the nitty gritty details of the Old Testament, New Testament, the conversation
I'm
about
not.
that.
I'm not. Unfortunately, one of the side effects of kind of being disenfranchised with evangelicalism is I haven't. I've kind of. It's brought up a lot of. I love the Bible. I love Jesus. I love the study of the scriptures, and I am just so thoroughly frustrated with how it gets weaponized to hurt the people that Jesus kind of claimed. The Jesus of the Bible represented.
Yeah.
So I was like really in it for a while, and so I'm not as sharp as I could be, but I think I mean, when you read it, it's transformative, and I just get so frustrated with how it gets weaponized and dumbed down, and kind of like, it's the fast food version of the Bible really pisses me off.
That's I've never heard that expression before. That's
It's what it is, man. It's just it's cheap. It's like easy to consume, but it's not real food, right? Like that's kind of what I think a lot of like the consumer Christian culture in America is turned it into. Is just you go, you find your answer, and you move on, as opposed to like really wrestling the stories. There's symbolism. There's so much beauty in how the texts were compiled and put together. And I think we're focused on, is it, you what is it, like, is every little detail happen exactly the way it's written? Like, there's a bunch of kind of things I think are nonsense that you miss the forest for the trees of like how beautiful it is,
mm-hmm.
and some of the value there.
Yeah.